I dreamt of a wily wolf and a swift stag blessing a sapling among the trees. It's a sign you'll make our people proud. And that's from The Telling of the Beads, Book 1 of Saplings of Sherwood, coming up next right here on The Right Stuff. Hi, and welcome to The Right Stuff. I'm the Queen, Parker J. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking to my guest co-host and contributor today, Avellina Balestri. She is the author of The Telling of the Beads, Book 1 of Saplings of Sherwood, and I cannot wait to tell you more about it in just a few moments. As always, I want to thank our Patreon team for their support. We have been showcasing Christian authors worldwide for the past 10 years. As God gives us grace, we'll continue to do so. If you want to help out, go to patreon.com/rightstuff. To stay up to date with PJC Media, simply subscribe to our YouTube channel at PJC Media. And so, without further ado, I'm going to bring Avellina on board. Avellina, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much, Parker, for having me on.
And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with me today. I don't take it lightly. And dear listener, Avellina and I have known each other through Facebook. So this is really the first time we're getting a chance to sit down and really dig behind the veil of who we are to each other. She's a wonderful woman of God. She has a wonderful magazine we'll talk about a little bit later, but we're really going to dig into this book today. And then she's going to tell us a little bit about herself and just express what it is about writing that she enjoys and just her views on fiction. So I cannot wait to dig into this topic with Avellina. But before I do that, Avellina, I already hinted to our audience that you're going to tell us a little bit about yourself. So go ahead and be candid with us today.
I have been involved in some form of writing or other, really from a very young age, since I probably was around 9, and, started journaling. I would either journal the things that happened to me or stories that I would come up with. Even before that, I feel like I was sort of automatically telling stories, even with my toys. I was coming up with kind of some elaborate plots, and I was very interested in legend and mythology from a young age. As well as in like the stories of the saints as well. I, was raised Catholic. I'm still a practicing Catholic. And so I was always very drawn to stories of holy men and women and the things that they experienced, the trials and tribulations, and also the triumphs that they went through in life. And so all of that kind of combined for me, both, these stories out of legends and mythology, and stories of the saints to kind of shape the stories that I wanted to tell.
I find myself also intrigued by mythology, legends, and I'm also intrigued by early church history because in their own separate ways, there's a bit of the fantastic to it all. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would, definitely. There's a sense of I think what C.S. Lewis called the numinous is kind of an awe. There's an awe that is involved in stories when you think about like King Arthur and stories that involve just all kinds of different things that contain something that makes us think beyond the scope of our day-to-day existence. It kind of imbues our day-to-day existence with some kind of enchantment, if you will. God's grandeur shot through our world and manifest in different ways. So I think that that's true with mythologies, but also in the stories of the saints. You can feel them kind of overlapping, if you will, and they do overlap in various cases. With King Arthur, we see the element of the Holy Grail and things like that. And there's a real sense of the sacred that is really just sort of crafting everything within the narrative. And I think that that is something that used to be the case, really, back in the day when we were more religious as societies. And when, even in pre-Christian times, you had this sense of things within pagan societies. And then when those pagan societies were christened, really, and the conversion to Christianity happened, this sense of the spiritual world remained very strong in the narrative styles of the people who were telling these stories. And you can see it also in things like Beowulf, one of the oldest, Anglo-Saxon pieces of literature, and how there are elements within it you can tell come from kind of a pagan universe, and elements that come from clearly a Christianization of that universe, and how the thing that's tying them together really is this sense of otherworldliness, of enchantment, that is kind of holding it all together.
There was also the sense of understanding the importance of looking back in time and gaining encouragement from those who have gone before us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that particularly when it comes to both church history and when it comes to mythology and legends. We admire some of these bigger than life characters because according to legend or according to myth or according to history, they did these great things. When you look at the early church saints, they dealt with horrific persecution, all in the name of serving Christ and in his name. And we could only hope to have that sort of faith and
Absolutely.
be able to rely on that. And so I've always found myself, just like you, fascinated by these old stories. You made another mention of something about the mythology and legend, how it had so much about religion underneath the narratives that it was told. And it reminds me of fairy tales, because fairy tales were used to help children understand, as C.S. Lewis said, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's not that there are dragons, but that dragons can't be conquered.
Mm-hmm.
You may be able to say it better than me. What do you see the important life lessons in these types of stories?
I completely agree with your assessment there in terms of these stories, whether they're fairy tales, legends, myths, or anecdotes from history, having this real sense of realizing the importance of looking up to the hero's journey, if you will. I mean, there is this sense that heroes and heroines are supposed to be there for us to draw hope from, draw inspiration from, to emulate, to learn from their mistakes as well. I mean, to learn, from, areas where they fell and then they got back up again, and areas where they overcame the hurdles that were before them. And there was so much importance laid upon that within almost every society you can think of throughout time. Each society had its own heroes, that people would tell the stories of these heroes in order to, give encouragement to the next generation and to keep the virtues that these figures embodied alive. And that was so important. And I feel like, sadly, we've become kind of a cynical age where we just we want to, subvert, these hero stories and not believe, sort of disbelieve in heroes. We were just talking about before the show, the movie The Green Knight, and how that subverted the hero's journey within the poem. And this is sort of a nihilistic manifestation of our present age, sadly. But, that just, it shows a kind of symptom of a disease we have. And I think it is really important that we return to that traditional storytelling that did emphasize virtue and heroism and basically goodness, truth, and beauty, which has sort of fallen into decline.
And I think that's where good fiction can really help to elevate people's ideas about things. When you write a good story and a good character, and the reader can relate to that character and understand that character's plight, sympathies, all of that, you actually help to bridge the gap between apathy and sympathy and empathy from there. That's what you did with this story here, the Seeds of Saplings of Sherwood series that you have here. And this is sort of like a telling of Robin Hood. Is that what we're looking at?
Yes, it is. So the overall series is called The Telling of the Beads, and this is the first book called Saplings of Sherwood. And the first book focuses on kind of Robin's origin story. So from when he is a small child, it opens when he's about 5 years old. And then it finishes the first book when he's about 16. And then the sequel, which I'm still in the process of working on, is going to open when he's 16 and follow on through to when he's eventually outlawed. But this is pre-outlawed Robin, and this is how Robin of Locksley, experiences these various elements of injustice in his society, because this is all taking place in the aftermath of the Norman conquest of England. So the Normans conquered the Saxons, and they displaced, the Saxon nobles, and, now they are the ascendancy. The Norman nobles are essentially running the show. And in my version of the story, Robin's family, the Locksleys, are the last Saxon noble house to hold an estate in Nottinghamshire. So they're the last sort of bastion of the old order in the Shire. And Robin's father is trying very, very hard to hold on to, what little he's able to kind of maintain and not rock the boat too much. And he has some reasons for that are legitimate. He feels that if you go up against the Normans straight up, they will just destroy you, and then he won't be able to aid his fellow Saxons at all. But Robin's mother feels differently. She feels like they should be fighting, against the Normans straight up. They should be engaging in a more outright kind of rebellion way. And so Robin is raised with these two different points of view and backgrounds, from his father, who's counseling prudence, and his mother, who's counseling, rebellion. And he kind of comes somewhere in the middle as he grows older, where he does see these various elements of injustice against his fellow Saxons all around him. As he grows older, he becomes increasingly aware of the brutality of many Norman lords towards the Saxons. And he is moved to want to fight for them, want to fight to defend them. But at the same time, he is falling in love as he's growing older in his teen years with a neighboring Norman girl, Marian. And so he has this situation going on where on the one hand, he has the tradition of, fight back, fight for your people, fight against the injustices. But on the other hand, he is aware that not all Normans are the same. They are individuals as well. They are people, and they behave differently according to their own morality. And so he is able to see the goodness in Normans through Marian. But so he finds himself really at a crossroads of trying to be the champion of his people, but at the same time coming to terms with this devotion that he has for Marian, and this desire really that he has through that relationship for the people of England, Norman and Saxon, to ultimately be one. This is his hope, even though it doesn't look likely it's going to happen at the time. It seems like it's just going to be a perpetual kind of brutal subjugation, and then perpetual rebellions, which create more cycle of brutality, and it just doesn't look good. But Robin is able to kind of draw hope that the situation may yet change. If he and Marian can love one another, then why can, there not be other breakthroughs as well?
I was listening to you talk about William the Conqueror and the Norman conquest of England. And the House of Wessex was a very powerful family, but they had declined over the years. One of the things that happened was how important marriage was. I cannot remember what her name was. She was sainted, I think, in the year 1200, but she married one of the kings, and she represented the last Saxon noble house.
Was this Margaret of Scotland?
Thank you. Okay. It was one of them, but she married, and I think she was sainted, but she was also very strong-willed.
Margaret of Scotland was from the Wessex royal house. She was related. So Margaret of Scotland was related to Edward the Confessor. So she was kind of from the last Saxon royal house. And she ended up marrying King Malcolm of Scotland. But yeah, she was from that last sort of royal Saxon family, which,
because they needed her. They needed her too. That marriage was extremely necessary in order to keep the peace, or somehow. I'm mixing up the history because I had researched that for something else I was working on. And I could remember how marriage was so important and why they had it. And that when I told you before we started chatting and recording for today, when I met the Archduke of Austria, and he talked about the Habsburgs, because they didn't have any army, they had marriage politics, and he talked about that, which is really interesting to listen to his conversation. Got a little bit off track here, dear, so I'll get back on it, but I'm just fascinated by this time period anyway.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a very fascinating time period. There's so many facets to it. And I think actually, it's funny when you just mentioned that. I think, Wessex was definitely, it's just triggered me that the Wessex connection, I think, was with Alfred the Great. So he had a whole thing going on with how his family, sort of maintained the kingdom of Wessex, which was kind of the beginnings of some type of unified England down the line. Although initially it still was, England was, kind of fractured into different Saxon kingdoms at the time. But Wessex was the kind of the one that we really associate with Alfred, who did sort of distinguish himself among the various Saxon kings in a way that, again, started to create the beginnings of what we know as England.
This whole area of history is extremely fascinating, and it's been very well researched and cataloged and excavated in different areas. So it's a very well publicized part of history, but we still don't know all the details about it. And I think that's what really appeals to me by historical fiction or historical fantasy. Which category does your book fall in?
So I would say that it is historical fiction / legend retelling. Okay. So on the one hand, it is very grounded in the historical time period. It's set, a little over 100 years since the Norman conquest, and it's dealing with the generational ramifications of it. So it's very much grounded in that sense. It really is dealing with the social layers of English society at the time, and various, just elements of the cultural and the religious moorings of that age. But at the same time, it is a legend. So we're dealing with characters who are not, historically verifiable. Most of them are composites, particularly Robin. He is a composite character who is based on various historical and mythical characters down through the ages, really. And so that's why each, person who has retold these legends kind of brings their own perspective, their own take to him. So in that sense, because there aren't many historically verifiable characters in it, except for we do, not in Saplings of Sherwood, but down the line in the series, we do get to meet characters like Richard the Lionheart and Prince John and Salahuddin, but they're not main characters. They're not. The main characters are all, legendary, if you will. So that's why I would emphasize that it is historical fiction / legend retelling, whereas, for example, my current project, which is dealing with the American Revolution, is just pure historical fiction. It's distinct. There are a lot of historical characters in it, and it's just way more kind of traditionally historical fiction.
One thing, too, about the legend of Robin Hood and his merry men is that it appeals to a wide variety of people. And oftentimes with these type of characters, we tend to see ourselves in that position. And we don't like oppression. We don't like things bad happening to us. So when they go against the status quo or go against those who are subjugating others to their will, as the legend has it, however you detail the legend, people are just drawn to that. So I want to talk about your new project that you're working on, and it's American Revolution project. And so what's that all about? What's going on with that one?
Sure. So basically, it's called All Ye That Pass By, and it's a trilogy. And the first book, which I am 10 chapters away from completing, I have 22 chapters finished, there's 10 more to go, is called Gone for a Soldier. And the base premise is that we follow a young man from a Catholic recusant family. So a recusant was someone who refused to take the Test Act that was basically necessary in England at this time. It started the various forms of it began in the 1500s, ran through the 1600s and the 1700s in this case, where we're focusing, where basically you had to ascribe to the Anglican Church. That's essentially where it's at. So you would take, Test Act, it started really with the Oath of Supremacy, which was under Henry VIII. It kind of started the tradition of these oaths and acts. And there was various different, again, manifestations of them down through the years. But by the time you get to this point in the story, which is in the 1770s, you have a situation where you have the Test Act. And the idea was to create a kind of conformity of religion within England. And you had basically it mostly targeting Catholics. I mean, if you read the Test Act, there's stuff very, very particularly where they're asking the people taking the act to deny all sorts of very specific Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation and the Pope and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it didn't just affect Catholics. It affected various other dissenting Protestants who were, not Anglican. And, it could affect Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, various sort of strains of Puritans and Separatists, Congregationalists. There was a wide sort of swath. And basically, people were affected to greater or lesser extents, depending on how much, the Test Act, I guess, struck against their beliefs. So with Catholics, it was very intense. With some of the other people, it varied because, so for example, you had an interesting situation with Presbyterians, where Presbyterians might not like the notion of the king as the, kind of head of or / governor of the Church of England. But in order to, kind of create some uniformity, they would sort of be willing to say, well, as long as what we kind of interpret the governorship of the king to be is just that he is protecting, for example, the rights and liberties of Protestants in the realm, we'll go with it. So you had some Presbyterians who would take it under that sort of view, and you had others who were saying, no, we won't take it. It's against our conscience. And basically the situation was, if you would not take the Test Act, you were barred out of so much of the society. You couldn't attend universities. You couldn't, get a career in the military. You couldn't get a career in legal work. You couldn't go into politics. You couldn't vote. Countless other aspects. At various places, you couldn't own horses. You couldn't own weaponry if you were Catholic, particularly. So there was all kinds of things that, and then of course you have to pay heavy fines as well to the Anglican Church. So all of this is to say that this is what it means to be a recusant. A recusant was someone who refuses. So what it would be is they'd refuse to take the Test Act, and they would have to kind of suffer the consequences within that society. So the main character of the story, Edmund, is from a Catholic recusant family that used to be a noble family, but they've since fallen on very hard times because of all of this. The heavy monetary penalties and just generally being cut out of most of public life. So in the storyline, Edmund ends up getting sort of surrogated, taken under the wing of General John Burgoyne, who's going to become the rather famous leader, British, commander of the Saratoga campaign in 1777. And of course, at this point, he doesn't know that's going to happen. So, he befriends Burgoyne, and Burgoyne is encouraging him to take the Test Act, to put aside his past disabilities, if you will, that are preventing him from rising in this society, and to come into the army with him to become an officer of the king. So, long story short, Edmund ultimately does so and ends up on the Saratoga campaign with Burgoyne. And along the route, everything kind of goes to hell in a handbasket. And not to give away too much, but yeah, among those things, that just happened historically, those who are aware of the Saratoga campaign will know what I'm talking about, for the British. But also for Edmund personally, he ends up in a kind of an ill-fated romance with an American girl who, is basically determined to try to rescue her father from a British prison hulk. And, basically their relationship has a lot of dynamics that reflect the situation between Britain and her colonies. So it's all very complicated, and Edmund increasingly finds himself, struggling with his conscience over what he did to come on this march, but also just so many layers of emotional stress and strain as everything starts to devolve. So this is basically his journey on of survival, in a sense, of how he's going to try to survive this and figure out where to go from there with so many divided loyalties.
I can see the thread between your Robin Hood story and this revolution story, just about the complexities of human nature. Sometimes in our current cultural norms and society, we tend to want to simplify human nature into one or two broad strokes. But just as you alluded to in Saplings of Sherwood, and just as you're alluding to your current work now, outside forces, inward convictions do clash at times.
Okay.
And because they clash, people are going to react in different ways. And depending on what the goal is or the objective is, you're going to be forced to make very difficult decisions. And those decisions can affect other people. And you can see that thread in both. So it makes me want to ask you this question. Are you drawn to complicated characters that cannot be boxed in? And is it because you see that within yourself? Because I have always been of the opinion that authors tend to write parts of themselves into their story. It may not be, you may not be the green frog princess or something like that, but there's something about your attitude or about your belief system or even about the way you view a particular situation that is reoccurring in your books. Do you think that is what draws you to these complex and very nuanced characters?
Yeah, I think that certainly I have an appreciation, I think, for the fact that we all are complex as human beings. I know that I am. I know that we all are really, there's not anyone who is, without these like multifaceted aspects of their character and personality. And as you said, the exterior forces that are affecting their like interior development. So it is something I think that's very important to me when doing, stories, not to just sort of rely on a very black and white template, if you will, of just, good guy, bad guy. And not to say, look, there are some characters who are, they do evil things. They are, they've crossed the line, if you will, into being proper villains. And then there's other characters who really are like very heroic and very virtuous characters. So it's not so much, people can make decisions that affect both their own, development and what they become and their impact on others. But at the same time, in every person, in every villain, if you will, there's some aspect of goodness, because of their very being. This is also something we were talking about earlier, but like Thomas Aquinas and Tolkien and others talked about, the idea of goodness is the real thing and evil is sort of a corruption of goodness. Evil is sort of a parasite of goodness. So even the most evil person, still by virtue of their being, has some goodness to them. And the same is true in our fallen world of good people still have flaws. Good people still make mistakes, sometimes very bad ones, and well-intentioned people still can basically hurt others. So that I think that those gray areas are things that I appreciate when I read them in other people's writings, when they take the time to explore those nuances. And I try to write what I would like to read, which is, I think it's also why I enjoy history, because history is full of that, of characters who are, very human, very multifaceted and complex. And I think that being aware of that and accepting that is a good sort of stepping stone towards compassion, because we can feel empathy for others based on that complexity within ourselves, if you will. We all have our own demons we're battling to some extent, and so being aware that others are in the same boat up and down the ages is something that I think can help us to become more, more compassionate and more sympathetic to others.
I just found myself just thoroughly enjoying our conversation. And dear listener, before we chatted, we were talking about The Green Knight, which was, I think, came out in 2021, I think. And The Green Knight is a poem, a medieval poem about Gawain. I cannot pronounce his full name. Forgive me.
Yeah, it's so funny. I've heard that pronounced like three or four different ways. Of like Gawain. Yeah, it's
it's one of them. Gawain. I'll just say Gawain. And forgive me, but The Green Knight is they called it like a adventure film, and it's just really a train wreck. And it's a train wreck because if you're familiar with the poem, you will understand why I truly hated it, because they completely changed the character of Gawain and they completely subverted it, and then they ended it in such a way that you were like, are you kidding me? Seriously, are you kidding me? This can't be serious. You can't be serious. But they took away the honorableness of that particular character and completely wanted to show us someone that was not true to the source material. And in this topic of the source material, Hollywood is very much interested, and I'll say Hollywood for right now, Hollywood is very much interested in existing IP that they can use and subvert. Why do you think that is?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, firstly, about what a train wreck The Green Knight was. I watched it in theaters and I was just like, what? By the end of it, I just literally...
Like, are you serious?
Yeah. It was like a weird fever dream. I'm just like, okay, a fever dream of just like, again, sort of intentionally trying to subvert the source material, which...
Do you remember the movie Madagascar with the Madagascar penguins?
I've seen trailers for that. I've not watched it though.
There's a scene in there where the penguins, they have this dream of going to Antarctica, right? We're going to go to Antarctica where a penguin can be a penguin. And so they finally reach Antarctica and it's all blustery snow, winds, cold, and they're looking, and what they thought it was not what it was. And they look at each other and the one guy goes, well, that sucks. Right?
Exactly.
That's how I felt about The Green Knight. That's exactly how I felt.
Yeah.
Like,
it was a massive letdown. It was just, and it was kind of sad too, because I mean, it's, I don't know. It's just like, it would be nice if they actually thought to make a movie about the actual Green Knight poem. Like, that would be really cool and interesting. But instead they decided they were going to just subvert it and undo the whole meaning of it. In order to kind of forward this weird nihilistic, I feel like it was even less than pagan, to be honest. Like, in other words, at least pagans, I mean, certainly Celtic, spiritual traditions, they had this very strong belief in an afterlife. Well, this thing just felt purely atheistic. So I'm like, it was almost sub-pagan. So,
which is why he couldn't be honorable, because it wouldn't matter. See, This is why belief becomes so important when you're writing certain things. Mind you, I like a good mindless movie like anyone else. I love my monster movies, my horror movies. But there are times when you cannot ignore the creator's underlying philosophical and religious beliefs when it comes to some of these stories. You just cannot ignore it, because they throw it in there. And that's why the fact that they completely subverted it, because any sort of honor would be that there was a reward at the end. Because if you act honorably, you are justly rewarded for your honor, even if obedience is that reward. And people don't understand that. Well, in The Green Knight, when they subverted it, there was no reward. He completely failed at every task. And then, okay, now we die. Or maybe he doesn't die. I don't know. So it kind of left it cliffhanger.
You know what? I think the point of that cliffhanger was to just hammer home the nihilism. So it's like, it literally doesn't matter if he dies or not, because nothing matters. Like, nothing mattered in the whole film. It's just, and I mean, that's sadly the age we're living in, where I feel like these kind of, like you said, getting back to the original question of like, why is Hollywood rehashing stuff ad nauseum? I mean, I think that it's just greed. And it's wanting to lean into getting, just monetary benefits from just repeating something that they think, would work. And they don't care if, in fact, they're twisting it out of shape from like the source material. So we talked earlier about Rings of Power. That was something that people didn't like, because it just was diverting from the source material in a bunch of different ways, and it felt extremely forced. The same thing is true of Velma, the Scooby-Doo.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And it's like, it was just, people don't want to watch something from like their fond childhood memories being, essentially violated like that. And that's what it felt like. I mean, I only saw, I think, maybe like half an episode of it and just quit.
Notice half an episode. I totally agree.
Yeah,
exactly. 8 minutes. We're done. Okay.
It was, it was just awful. It was just like, and again, sort of like a similar thing where you feel like they're deliberately trying to defile, if you will, something that was innocent, something that was a positive memory for kids, for kids who grew up on Scooby-Doo. And it was just like, why? It's almost like this weird perverse desire to take something innocent or wholesome or meaningful in the case of like the Green Knight poem, and to make it cynical, to make it just kind of vile, to be honest. I mean, when you think of Zelma, one of the reasons, I mean, there's so many things that were wrong with it, but it really was nasty. Like the humor that they were attempting to inject into it was just nasty. They made Velma, the character, nasty. Everything about it was just kind of low and mean and gross, you know? So it was just, again, it's a sad state of affairs when that kind of thing has become the norm, of just taking stuff and then sort of subverting it in a way that is, you know, cynical and trying to sell that. And and then of course there's other examples that aren't, it's not as affected by the cynicism element, but it's cynical in another way. And so, like, think about all the Disney remakes.
Oh gosh.
So it's just bad. Like, it's cynical of the production company. It had to think that, you know, oh, we can just take classic Disney cartoons, which worked for very specific reasons. They worked in an animated genre, really. And we can just pump them out there in live action and you know, rake in the bucks. But it's just cringe. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of
well, actually, if I may interject here, when you were talking about Velma, it reminded me, and for me, because like I said, I grew up with horror, it reminded me of the remake The Predator. And The Predator from 2018 was just a massive train wreck. I mean, cars were spilling out everything. And I don't know if you're into horror like I am, but with The Predator, one of the things that bothered me so much is that they took my childhood monster and made a joke out of it. And The Predator, when we first see it back in the 80s, I was a child when I saw Predator. So mind you, I don't think a 5-year-old should watch Predator, you know, PSA. But my grandmother did not care. We used to watch horror with her all the time. My mom would get so angry. So we were watching Predator at Grandma. So I remember my grandma. Oh yeah, I'm screaming behind Grandma. You know, I'm screaming behind her. And so we were watching. And the thing about the Predator was that this was an entity that was evil. And he was so powerful that these grown men from very different backgrounds who can handle themselves in the world in different situations were suddenly being picked apart and picked and destroyed rapidly by this enemy. So these big, strong, massive men, you know, men who've been in war, were being picked apart by this single entity. And a guy who goes from being pretty confident to being scared and terrified, where the only thing that saved him in the movie before the end is when he's covered in mud, because it was the only time the Predator could not see him, right? And then toward the end, he has this final stand. One of the other characters had a last stand before he decided to go out with honor, even though the Predator killed him. So in The Predator from 2018, they made a massive joke out of it. They kept making comedy. I said, no, this is a monster. It's a monster. And then they subverted the monster to where it was more concerned about other socioeconomic things that were prevalent at the time. And I'm like, I just want to watch a sci-fi movie. My gosh, you know, right? I want to watch my sci-fi horror monster film.
Yeah, no, that happens
like you
so
said
often.
About so like what you said about Velma making things cynical or making things that are really serious, making very light of them, because we are sometimes faced with very difficult situations that could actually change us. Like when Arnold Schwarzenegger left the jungle after he ultimately defeated the Predator, he did come back laughing about it. I'm pretty sure his character had PTSD for the rest of his life. Not to mention the fact, oh gosh, there's aliens, right? There's aliens out there, because he saw the ship at the end of the movie. He saw the ship come down and got the body. Oh my gosh! I mean, worldview has been completely changed now. So they went from that to, oh, we're not that flipped out that we see aliens. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. And then they kept making joke after joke after joke. It's like, what are you doing? You know. So
yeah, poorly
It's
injected
difference.
humor. Yeah, no, poorly injected humor can literally destroy. Well, because I think what it is that, there's a time and a place, and there's certain things where they're not funny. And like you're saying, Velma, it's that way with like a serial killer who's murdering girls in the school and taking their brains out, and that's supposed to be funny because they're just targeting the hot girls or whatever. And it's like, is that funny? It's like
I'm sorry. I must have missed what funny was. I don't know. Where's my dictionary? Let me find that. Yeah. So, and then the opposite was making things that are quite serious and just injecting humor. Again, it's that nihilistic tendency to try to subvert meaning and to say there is no meaning. And there's no meaning, then the pain. And this is something we can get to as we get ready to close our conversation today. One of the things I think pain is necessary to remind us that our pain matters, right?
Yes.
I think that, of course, we want to live a life without pain. But as I had a show on here about a year and a half ago, Avellina, and it was a pastor who had lost his young son. He was about 15 years old. And he talked about how there are things about the Lord we wouldn't know if we didn't have pain or if we didn't go through suffering. For example, he said we wouldn't know he's a comforter if we didn't need to be comforted. And we wouldn't know that he can heal us if we never got sick. We wouldn't know that he could provide for us supernaturally sometimes if we were never in want. And too often there is this Christian myth that we're supposed to live a life of ease. And that's why one of the things I truly am not an advocate of the prosperity gospel. With health, wealth, and prosperity, I'm not sure where they got that part of the Bible from. And it's a very abhorrent ideology, a very sick doctrine that has really infiltrated various church circles.
And clearly they haven't done much. I mean, when you start looking at, again, the lives of the early Christians, it's like, no, that doesn't.
They missed the message. They obviously missed the message. And so I say that for this reason as we get ready to close. It's been a fascinating conversation with you. And dear listener, we had something completely different when we were talking before we recorded, and we just totally went off track. But then you got two extroverts on the phone here. I mean, on the mic here. So what are you going to do?
Like, I think we covered a lot of interesting things, though. So we'll just have to do it in multiple shows.
So, dear listener, take what you want from the conversation, because we're going to be back and talk more about saplings of Sherwood. Recently, I posted a show to my YouTube, and it was about Bigfoot. It was a Bigfoot Sasquatch thriller. And someone thought it was an actual story and not an interview like I'm doing with you. And in the comment section, someone said, no one cares about fiction. And I said, is that really true? Do people not care about fiction? Is fiction necessary? If that's the case, why do writers write stories? Should we just throw away our pens and let the AI do it? I mean, what do you think as we get ready to close our discussion today? What do you think, Avellina?
Well, I think that, when it comes to fiction, at the end of the day, I think maybe the broader term for it is storytelling. What is the role of storytelling, whether it's in written or spoken form or song form, or however, we are creatures that must tell stories. There's a Madeleine L'Engle quote that I'm probably going to mess up, but basically the idea of responding to the world, through painting and, singing and storytelling. And through that, we find truth, because we are creatures that seek meaning in the, the opposite really of these absurdist, kind of nihilistic takes. Stories are not fundamentally, they can't be nihilistic and function as they are meant to function. Stories are always, in their proper sense, about finding meaning. If there is no meaning, the story is broken. It's, the story doesn't work as it was intended to work. Because ultimately, stories are about that draw, if you will, I believe, towards God. And God allowing us to subcreate was the word Tolkien used, like how God is a creator. And he enables us to create as well. We subcreates. within his creation. And there's another term he uses called sacramental imagination. Of course, Tolkien was Catholic, so he had this view of sacramentality. But the idea, for me, what it means is that stories have the ability to impart grace. That's the idea. Stories can connect us to God, to things beyond ourselves, to goodness, truth, and beauty, and to one another. It has, this power which can transform us. Stories are, told well with an awareness of this transcendence, an awareness of really goodness, because even like you were just saying with regards to even stories involving like horror, for example, or pain or suffering, it's still the idea that we're acknowledging pain, horror, and suffering implies goodness. Because we're looking at these things and we're saying they have meaning. It matters what we go through in this world. And there is ultimately a meaning that does direct us towards the good, if you will. The darkness directs us towards the light. And so that is why stories are important. And that is why fiction, if you will, the, art of storytelling as we do, and, the books that we write and we publish and so forth, has a meaning. And I think that the people who are saying, oh, nobody cares, I don't think that they even mean that. I think that they're trying to be a bit, kind of absurdist about it. But I don't think that they actually, at the end of the day, really mean it.
Avellina, thank you so much for being here with me today. Really enjoyed the conversation and enjoyed having you, and cannot wait to have you back and have you back real soon.
Well, thank you so much, Parker. This was really enjoyable, and I look forward to future conversations as well, both privately and, on the show. So thank you so much.
And we were talking today to Avellina Balestri. She is the author of the series Saplings of Sherwood, and the first book in that series is The Telling of the Beads, which is available on Amazon.com or wherever books are sold. So make sure you go ahead, love on my sister, and get your copy today. One thing I was invigorated by Avellina's discussion is just her really in-depth and considered view about these things that we were talking about. She talked about fiction, she talked about history, she talked about faith. And one thing she said about the art of storytelling is how we can use storytelling to connect each other. But you, dear listener, you may be in the audience listening to this podcast today, and God has put a story within your heart. Is it a story like Avellina's, where she's going back to Britain and exploring legendary folklore? Is it a historical fiction novel? Is it a sci-fi? Is it a horror story like I like to read? What about fantasy? What if it's a mystery? Whatever it is, what are you waiting for? Go ahead, pick up the pen, and write stuff. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of The Right Stuff. I'm the Queen, Parker J., and you have a wonderful, absolutely glorious, blessed day.